everybody. The topic of this afternoon is what to expect when you invent something completely new. What is going to happen afterwards? So you're standing in front of the brilliant new idea, the invention, the thing that you just demonstrate to work, and what is going to happen next. And when I discuss that, I will also discuss different versions of the innovation diffusion paradigm. But before I start, I would like to thank Mauricio, Vincent, and Laure. By the way, if you Google one of them, you find all of them on the same page. So, what a team! It's no joke. Type in Google images Mauricio Camargo Nancy, and it's truly, you can check it. So, what I'm going to do is, in 8 steps, I'm going to lead you through the idea of what is going to happen after the invention of something completely new. And what I will do is I will present the mainstream model and why I think it's not right. And so I also have an alternative model, and I'm going to compare them, and I will spend a while to explain that model and illustrate it. But I will tell you there's 4 different messages I will give you. If they don't make sense now, they will become completely clear at the end of the lecture. If they were clear, by the way, wouldn't make sense to have the whole lecture. So innovation diffusion is such a complex phenomena that you can only approach that by looking simultaneously on different levels of analysis. So you can study it by looking at individuals and what happens in their brain when they're creative, when they're thinking of new things. You can look at teams, how they cooperate. You can look at projects, the way they create new things. But you can also look at a market level, where one technology over decades is developing and evolving. Or you can even look on a higher level, on the level of the disciplines where many different technologies emerge, disappear, combine, and so on. And in fact, innovation is a game where you have to consider, if you want to be close to what actually happens, you have to be able to jump from level to level and see how they interact. At least that's my conviction. So the second message is, the mainstream innovation diffusion paradigm is unrealistic for radically new high-tech innovations. It's a very special model, and I'll explain you why it doesn't fit. Well, it's very interesting that not only in this case, but in fact I found out as a scientist in almost every case where I use a methodology or a model, always I feel like, hey, if you really want to master that, you have to go back to the time it was created. What was the context? What was the application when the model or the theory was created? And in that context, it was really smart. But because of the context, there's a lot of implicit assumptions. They're not put into a manual. And those implicit assumptions make that when later on many people use the theory or the model without checking the assumptions, that they use it completely wrong. And it's interesting to see that the innovation diffusion paradigm is one of the most used paradigms into innovation management, yet it is a very special case that doesn't hold on things that you are working on. And that is very strange to find out. So, I'll explain why a realistic model makes sense. Well, interestingly, the first message is very easily explained in terms of the reason why we cooperate. So, to be honestly, I thought in the beginning of my career, and I thought I only cooperate with people because they're nice or intelligent. Well, indeed, all the ones I do cooperate with are, but there's a third reason, and that is in fact that you cooperate with people that are intelligent and nice and complementary. And this is why it makes sense to work together. And if you, in a little bit simplified way, describe the complementarity between the institutes, then you can say that Nancy is really top in terms of managing projects in the vicinity of companies, in groups of companies, making it actually happen in the environment of a company. Whereas my work is much more on a macro scale, where it describes what happens over decades, which is a whole different storyline. But they interact, and we will see how. Okay, what I would like to do is just bring you in a situation where we have an invention. So what we're going to do, we're going back to the 1960s in the United States, and we're in a military lab. And what you see in front of you is a man with a coat on, a laboratory coat, and he's standing in front of a table, and on that table are cones from metal, alloys. These are different combinations of metals, alloys, and in front of each cone is a small paper describing the characteristics of the alloy. Now what do we see here? What we see here is a military lab where a scientist has created a whole set of different combinations of metals which are to be used in the military industry. Now what they want is that they are ultra hard. For example, those cones can be used on the nose of a missile. So what happens is that this scientist has a sort of a hypothesis about which alloys, which combinations would be ultra hard. So he sort of selected those combinations and created them in front of him. Now all of a sudden the telephone rings, 1960s, no mobile phones by the way, so it was a fixed telephone. He turns around, and when he does so, his coat sort of touches one of the cones. The cone, while he's standing with his back towards the cone, is falling on the floor, and what he hears is blop. That's not supposed to be the sound of something ultra hard. So he's surprised, and he turns back and he sees that the cone is deformed as if it were a piece of clay. That's strange. Well, he goes, answers the phone, comes back, and since these metals are really precious, he's deciding to melt the two metals because, hey, you can reuse the metals. And when he then is heating up the metals, the alloy, all of a sudden the cone returns to its original shape. So it's a memory metal. Well, if that were the invention for which we had to predict what is going to happen, if we were to commercialize that brilliant finding, what would you like to know? What would you like to know to go on and commercialize this? What is the information? Any ideas, by the way? What would you like to know to go on and commercialize, make money out of this? What it costs? Yeah, definitely. Precious metals, quite expensive. Any other ideas?
Intellectual property?
Yeah, I would like to protect it. Definitely.
What would be the markets?
Yeah, the applications. Yeah, of course. So, hey, he's in business. So you recognize all of a sudden who's doing business. So, Johan, thanks a lot. You're saving my lecture. I was waiting for this answer, obviously. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I pay him a lot to say this. So, you would like to know the application. So what can you do with a memory metal? When you find such a phenomenon, you have no idea what you can do with this. By the way, just to let you know, you can have a memory metal spring, you deform it, you then heat it up, and it returns to its original shape. And if you allow an economist to explain to you how that works, you know better than I do probably, it's because there's different substable states of the lattice from which the alloy is created. Don't pose questions about that to me, because I don't know the answer. So here, the cost is important, IP is important, but in fact you don't even have a clue where to go, what to develop out of this, what is the market, what are the applications. Let me just give you one other example. In 1839, Becquerel sort of presented the working principle of a wet solar cell, meaning that he had two fluids, two metal plates connected by a wire. If one of the plates was into the sunlight, a current started to flow. And then later on, a few years later, late 19th century there was almost a solid state, and 1883 there was a solar cell which is in fact almost the same as what our current solar cells. Unbelievable. Now in the case of the memory metal we didn't know the applications, but in this case it was very specifically described exactly what would be the applications. Now you have to understand the historical context, because at that time all major European cities were going to be electrified. So Berlin, for example, already had electricity, Amsterdam had electricity. I don't know whether Stanislas created electricity in Nancy already, but probably Nancy already had electricity around 1900, I'm quite sure. And the interesting thing is that the one working on that was very, very exact more than a century ago about the applications that you could think of. Now, so what is the sort of the general theme that we're in? The general theme is that we're talking about radically new high-tech components, products or systems. That is the group of phenomena that we look at. They have either a completely new type of functionality, they're depending, they're functioning because of a new principle, and so you have several examples. It can be materials, can be simple products, can be complete systems, but it can be GPS, it can be mobile telephony. 1949, first mobile telephony system in the Bell Labs, unbelievable. This is the game. And we're standing at the invention, and basically the question is, so what is going to happen? We would like to know. We would like to have some perspective. Now, usually the metaphor for this expectation is this. It's like you have a brilliant finding, and the market is like a huge mountain that you can explore and you can make profit. So that's what you think. Everybody is going to use solar cells. That's what you think in 1900. And in a way, the mainstream model of innovation diffusion, development and diffusion, in a way reflects this. Because the mainstream model basically says, okay, we have a time axis, and the first set of this scheme, there is a project. It can be an agile project, can be a stage gate project, can be a hybrid version, but a kind of a project. It can be a program of project. And well, if you finish that, you turn this invention, this principle, into a new product that you can sell. That's the idea. And when you do that properly, you bring it to the market, and then it starts diffusing. You're selling. Some people are starting to use it, implement it. And although in the beginning it goes a little bit slowly, it goes quicker, and then all of a sudden at the end, the market is saturated, or all potential customers are reached. And this is why it bends down. This is the well-known diffusion S-shaped curve. Now you might say this is a very simple model, but in a way it's an unbelievably unique marriage of different groups in science that did agree now once. First of all, you have like the Association of Product Developers in Industry in the United States, the PDMA, who really were developing the way you develop those projects. You structure them the way you do it. We're talking about the 1970s. And the first journals in innovation management appeared late 1980s, but the association already started in the 70s. Journal of Product Innovation Management, I think it was in the 1980s with the first editor, Hustad. So industry was involved. Science started to explore the projects, how to manage them. And the S-curve was work done by sociologists who, after the Second World War, were investigating how innovations diffuse. Now, these were completely different scholars. They combined efforts, and it became the innovation diffusion paradigm, a unique thing that almost everybody agrees on. And in fact, if you look carefully to historical cases, you see many examples where you see this S-curve appearing. You see it for telephones in the 20th century, you see it for televisions in the 20th century. Almost perfect S-curves are the telephone, and there's a little bit of a dip during the Second World War, but that makes sense. You see the S-curve with a little bit of trembling, but they're there. Interestingly also is you see also that some of these diffusion efforts, they stop. And you see, for example, that Philips tried to introduce interactive CDs, the kind of a CD player which you could use with, or interactive television was already introduced in the 1980s. They all failed, and you can see, in fact, that was reflected in the S-curve, which stopped very soon. So in fact now, our whole line of reasoning is complete. We have projects, we have diffusion. If diffusion goes well, it's successful, and that's it. Now there's one slightly discomforting thing here in this beautiful story, as if we are sort of destroying this beautiful marriage where everybody agrees and is happy with each other. And that is that the historians of technology found out that in the beginning of new technologies, they're not diffusing smoothly. No way. So what I did is in my research, very naive, by the way, I have to be honest, I started to is a selection of cases. You see, the time in which they were introduced, from about 1850 up to later, up to about 2000, different industries, and in all of them there are cases in which I really carefully explored, okay, so when were they first demonstrated to work? When were they first applied in the market? And if so, where? And when were they produced and implemented and used on a large scale? Where did it start to take off? Well, so that is a really broad heterogeneous set. This is only 49, but I did that for 125 different technological innovations. And what you see here, by the way, you see Sandra and Mohammed, both students of me that used my data, and they together with me did work on that. One of the outcomes was this table. And what you see is that from those 49 cases, divided over the industries, in fact, all of them almost had different small-scale applications which were completely different from the large-scale application that appeared later on. Meaning that 80% from all those 50 cases showed that the diffusion doesn't start smooth, but it starts really erratic with trial and error. Application in a niche, it fails. Application in a niche, it fails. Application in a niche, it fails. And only 20% behaves as the mainstream innovation diffusion model. And that is discomforting, because it doesn't fit. Now, what you see in this table, by the way, you see that the pharmaceutical and healthcare equipment is a bit of an outlier. There's only a very small number of niches, so there is, in fact, there the exception of the innovation diffusion paradigm can be found. So if you prepare a medicine, if you develop a medicine, it takes a while. But if you have it, it usually starts to diffuse on a large scale, which makes sense, because it's the exception to the rule, because this is one of the only markets where you exactly know how many people have a particular disease for which you develop a medicine. Therefore, it is different than the other ones. But if you use the mountain as a metaphor, probably in the previous picture you have ignored the small lake in front of that. Now, if you were prepared with your mountain climbing equipment to just climb into the mountain, you would have been drowned before you even started to climb. That's the metaphor. So you don't survive that phase if you're not prepared to go through it. And if you're not prepared, if not somebody is telling you, this is where you have to survive, this is what happens. if you now take an example, just to illustrate what happens in a particular case, you can say television was demonstrated in around 1930. And it was first applied in 2 different countries, completely independently, in Germany, in hospitals, where soldiers, if they came back from the Eastern Front in Eastern Europe, and they were in the hospital, they could see shows while they were in bed. And in the UK, there were local systems with televisions where you could go to a bar, sip from your beer, and then at the same time see sort of a game or something on television. Now, then the Second World War happened, and then in 1948, really in the US, this diffusion started, and in the Netherlands it was 1950s. To be honest, my family was really late in the 1960s to have the first television set, which was black and white, so I went to my neighbor friend who had a colored television at that time. Well, what does it mean? It means, one, first of all, you have the time, 1930 up until 1939, before something, that is the time it lasts to get something in the market. That is exactly longer, that is maybe 10 times longer on average than a project to develop something. It's really long. And then instead of applications that are really representing the later mainstream applications, you see many of these small scale applications, and then it starts. So, let's go and discuss a little bit in detail what happens. Let's start with the first phase. I phrased that as the innovation phase. It's not a perfect phase because innovation is in fact occurring over the entire scheme. Well, what you see is it is much longer on average. It's more than 10 years on average for my entire set, from the beginning to the first introduction. And it's not true that there's one project in one company or one program in one set of companies. No, it's like an activity in one company, another activity in another company. Some of them know from each other and are competitors. Some of them don't even know. Some projects are in different parts of the world. Sometimes there's even different parts within companies that don't know from each other. Some compete with each other. Sometimes they develop the principle but don't develop a product, and it's on the shelf for several years. And this chaos is not a project. Innovation on this scale is not a project. For example, paracetamol, to give an example. Paracetamol, of course, we were really always searching for pain relief instruments, like aspirin. But aspirin, you have a problem that it hurts your stomach. Paracetamol was created, it was tested clinically on dogs. And when it was tested on dogs, one of the dogs fell dead. Of course, the dog was investigated, and it turned out to be that the dog had a sort of a lesion, a cut into his heart. And then all of a sudden, paracetamol was banned. Because, hey, if you swallow paracetamol, probably your heart will fail. 50 years later, somebody asked the question, so why did the dog die, in fact? It didn't have anything to do with paracetamol. After that, it went very fast with paracetamol. So, that is not a project. By the way, in the pharmaceutical industry, now we're there, the fact that all brilliant type of medicines, many brilliant type of medicines don't survive the first phase. There's molecules for particular medicines, and they're not developed because there's no funding or nobody picks them up. That is referred to as the valley of death. And then the second phase is, I call that the adaptation phase. There you see completely different products. Now, if we stay in this pharmaceutical area, why not? Let's go to the contraceptive pill. In the 1960s, that was really something special. But for several reasons. Because it was special because it was a hormonal way to have a contraception. But it was also special because it was a way in which women could take control. And in the fundamental Christian religious society of the US, That was not possible. So in fact, the one who was developing this pill tested it on rats. They were infertile temporarily after swallowing the pills. And he introduced the pill as a skin irregularity medicine, which was approved by the FDA. Now that is something different than, so that is an example of such a small scale application. And then it would last more than a decade of those specific experimental applications before it really started. Now what you see is that there's, if you have this generic model on the left side, you can also distinguish scenarios. Because one of the weaknesses of my work is, as you found out, it's historical. And if you select historical cases that are successful, inevitably you don't find the ones that stop halfway. That's a disadvantage of my approach. But what you can do is, so in fact you can say in any of these stages the whole process can stop. So the uncertainty that an entrepreneur is, or a manager is faced with, is much larger than what I find. It is many, many times bigger. Because in any phase it can stop, and in any phase this technology can be combined with another technology, in which case there's a completely new stream started. And for example, in television you had electromechanical versions of the television. That was dropped after, in the middle of this trial and error phase, and then the electronic television took over. By the way, I always try to find examples where technologies fail, but it's quite hard, because some technologies seem to have failed and then return all of a sudden. Like this transport in huge balloons, I forgot the name again. It's every time... Zeppelin, exactly, that was what I... Zeppelin is every time returning, and every time I think, oh, this is a failed type of invention. It's not. Now, interestingly, it's now clear that the innovation diffusion paradigm, as it is known, is in fact a special case of the more general evolutionary scheme that I'm providing. So I don't say that it's complete nonsense, I say it's a special case. I would like to say something about why this happens. Why does this erratic type of thing happen? Why doesn't it go smoothly? Why is it not like a chemical process that smoothly builds up as in diffusion? Well, there's many different types of model and classes of models by which you can describe and explain this. But let me just give you a few factors that can turn out to be a barrier that's blocking large-scale diffusion and hence creates this chaotic behavior. Yeah, in many cases, a brilliant finding doesn't have a real good performance. I mean, if you had the first virtual reality systems on your head, you had a complete system like this, you couldn't move because your neck was aching. It was very rudimentary what you could make visible. By the way, late 1960s, Sutherland, unbelievable. The invention of augmented reality and virtual reality. But the performance was so low that it was only a principle. Nobody would like to buy this commercially. And there's not only a competition with the previous technology on performance, there's also, if you look at wind energy, wind turbines for example, you have also competition between the different versions. So you have double competition. New technology, old technology, different versions of the new technology. And that becomes chaotic if you combine them. We have an issue with the price, which was obviously a problem with the solar cells. The solar cells, by the way, were first implemented on satellites because nobody cared about the price of that. And the alternative, batteries, was too heavy to send into space. So price is an issue. Production, sometimes if you go into material science, like Kevlar or Dyneema, it's a Dutch strong fiber. Nobody knows that, but hey. I'm paid to tell that. in many cases in the chemical industry you have a molecule or a substance, but you don't have the way to produce it on a large scale. So for Dyneema, for example, it's a polyethylene solution. And this solution you stir, like in a coffee cup, you have a stick and you stir in the coffee cup as if you have sugar in your coffee. And if you do that, there will be sort of short fibers on your stick. Yeah, brilliant. But this is not a way to produce on a large scale. Now, it took like decades before the gel spinning process was developed in DSM to produce this fiber really on an industrial scale. A similar thing you can see with nylon, with other fibers, with other materials. So production is really important. Well, obviously, if you go, for example, talk about electric cars, complementary products and services, sometimes everything is almost there, but there's nobody really taking up and combining and forming a network of actors producing it. Well, no customers, it happens for various reasons. And if you, for example, look at the automotive vehicle, that was, by the way, demonstrated in the US and at the same time in Munich in 1983 by the Universität der Bundeswehr. There was a Mercedes bus which was driving from Munich to Paris 95% without a driver. There was a driver for safety reasons. And it needed to be a bus because the computers couldn't make it so small. But this whole problem with the institution is that our law about driving is that the one who's driving is responsible. And that doesn't work when you have an autonomous vehicle. Okay, so what we have is we have an adapted model, we have some causes why it appears. Let's now say what the consequences are, if it's there. For you, if you are a manager or an entrepreneur, and you're bringing something to the market, what does it mean for you? Well, of course, the time is an issue. And there's a huge risk in terms of that if you have something which is a brilliant finding, it takes so long before you can really commercialize it on a large scale. And don't misunderstand how you can misunderstand the implications of a new phenomena. Halfway the 90s, 1995, I was working in a telecommunication lab, so I was amidst all of the new telecommunication developments. And then I was asked to be a co-presenter for somebody who was presenting a telecommunication thing. That was a small screen with a typing board like this big, the screen. You could plug it in the telephone line, and then you could sort of ask for information, buy things, and it was so bad. We felt like, who the hell is going to use something like this? 2 years later, one of my colleagues was inviting all of the managers. I became a manager at that time. And the problem is, I was writing down what I did. That I now really are unhappy about that because now I can prove how stupid I was. But so there was this colleague, and he was inviting all the managers because they had a new finding, and we were having a very advanced lab because it was a lab with a living room where you could present inventions in the environment where people would normally use it. And the guy was sitting on the couch, and we were like this dressed. The guy was, of course, he was sitting on the couch. We were looking at him. Hey, Jans, what's up? Tell us. And he said, yeah, you know what I'm doing? No, but tell us. I said, yeah, I'm just browsing on the internet. 1998. I'm browsing on the internet, and this is my thing by which I browse on the internet. We said, hey, come on, wake up. And we went off the room. We stopped the project, stopped the funding. What an idiot. So this is how you think at that time. And you don't believe it right now. Oh, but I can tell you more of how you see it at that time. You don't even know the applications at that time. So this small appliance, we didn't understand that telemarketing, internet at home, what the implications would be. Unbelievable. Might be true, but in order to have that all, you really need to build up a lot before it works. Because before you have that internet system where you can sit on a couch and order something, in the 1990s, nothing of that was there. So you need to build up a complete supply chain. By the way, work of Brunel, you fit the supply chain to the product. The product is there, but you have no clue what the supply chain should look like. And one thing for sure, it's not yet there. That's blocking you. Now, this all means that you are starting to enter a very, very risky game. And especially if what we did is we tracked for many inventions how many actors, how many companies entered and left the market. Now, of course, what you expect is true. In the mid-phase, many actors do enter and do go bankrupt. They crash and burn. And then 5 to 10 years later, somebody else goes into the market and becomes filthy rich. By the way, the inventor then already died. Oh, and by the way, now you're going to tell me in one of the questions, I hope, by the way, you have questions in the end. Isn't that speeding up a lot, this process? Now, bad news, from 1850 to 2000, it didn't. Not at all. Okay, so here you see the comparison. On the left side, we have the mainstream theory, which says innovation is a project. If you manage that properly, you have success. That success is measured in terms of diffusion. And it becomes predictable and you can fit the curve. So this is all about management, managed properly. And this is more chaotic. It says, well, innovation is not a project at all, if you track historically what happens. It's a combination of projects. It's a fuzzy competition. It's Darwin. Success is not only based on managerial action, but much more on entrepreneurial action. You have to dare to go. Maybe you survive, maybe you're successful, maybe not. And the most successful products in the end, they do really diffuse chaotically. And success is not something that you can manage, but it requires really persistent action. Well then, and now I'm coming to the end, the question is, of course, why is it possible that a mainstream model is created, which everybody is using, which is completely wrong? Or am I crazy? That's something else. So, why is this possible? And to be honest, if you go and you look at methods and theories, you see this happening more often. Okay. Now, first of all, let me really express my admiration of the ones who created that model. They're brilliant. But they created a brilliant thing in a very specific situation. So after the Second World War, there was a new type of corn. And corn in the US was really an important thing. Now, some of the corns were vulnerable to rot and diseases. So obviously there was a need for corn that was not vulnerable to diseases, to rot. You wanted to have high quality corn. A hybrid corn was created by sort of mingling different races. And when that was created, that corn was dominant in all different aspects that you can imagine. Which means that a competition on performance and on price was not an issue in that very special case. Another thing is there is no lock-in with the previous technology, because farmers every year again decide whether they are going to seed. They have to bring in seed for the new year's corn. So they decide, okay, what corn are we going to buy? We see that next year we have the yield. So there is like a logic frame which is completely different than in normal industries where you have no persistent lock-in. Well, the innovation was created and it remained almost the same over its life cycle, which is non-typical in practice. The production and the institutions, everything was in place. In that case, the ones who were studying this case, obviously were very smart when focusing on the characteristics of the farmers. And the farmers, the question was, which of the farmers are going to adopt this first? That was the only question left, because tick, 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 all the conditions were very special. And in that case, you get an innovation diffusion paradigm where the focus is completely on the demand side of the market, on the characteristics of the innovators, which are the farmers, and then the high educated, cosmopolitan farmers, and so on, and so on, and so on, were the innovators, and then there were characteristics of the later adopters. And if you track that research line, for more than 60 years, there is thousands and thousands of scientific work on the characteristics of innovators in different markets. So this has unbelievably inspired huge schools of scientists. Special again is it's a relatively homogeneous market, which is non-standard. Okay, now what you see is, you see all of a sudden that there's a whole set of implicit conditions in the mainstream paradigm in innovation diffusion. Product performance should be better than any other thing in the market. Price should be lower. Production should be ready and available. Complementary products and services should be in place. The network of actors that provide this to farmers should be already all there. Customers should understand it and should be there. Well, they were there, the farmers. And institutions should be organized in a way that you could easily, as a farmer, adopt the corn and go. Well, there was only one unknown. And that was this. And this is how the scheme developed. So I don't blame the ones who created this. I blame the idiots who adopted this without checking. That's the point. So, what are the conclusions? Well, I told you it's, I think, very important to look on different levels. And if you now combine, you can say, okay, here we have a project. It's a micro level of activity on innovation. And if you position a project into my scheme, you see that is like a dot in the scheme. But it's interesting to study both, because it really makes a difference whether you're having a project in the first stage, in the second stage, or in the third stage. By the way, the way you manage the project will influence that scheme on a macro scale also. So there's a mutual relationship. And to make sense of innovation, you need to combine those. That's the point of the first message. Well, I think this point was, I hope, made. Very intelligent innovation diffusion paradigm. I'm really fond of it. It only works in special cases. And why does that happen? Well, because it's a very intelligent model in a very specific situation, created very wisely for that situation. And why is it relevant to adopt a more realistic model? Well, suppose you think innovation diffusion paradigm will happen, and you have, for example, a transistor, and you feel the market is ready, let's go, and you prepare a huge factory to produce a particular type of Germanium transistors, 1946. And it's like an obvious case. You're going to be filthy rich when you do that. And in the years in between your building of the factory and the first introduction, there's a new type of transistor which is much better, and you can burn down your factory. So if you go and you have the wrong paradigm, it will be very costly and you will make huge mistakes. So it does misinform you. That's the point. Thanks a lot. Merci beaucoup.